You know that feeling when you can't sleep and your mind starts wandering to the strangest places? Well, tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey, not to a distant planet or a fantasy realm, but somewhere far more terrifying, back in time, to what might just be the absolute worst period in human history to have ever drawn breath. Picture this. It's 2 million years ago. The world is a completely different place. No cities, no technology, no medicine, no safety, just raw, unforgiving nature. And in the heart of Africa, our ancestors, if you can even call them that, are struggling to survive each day in ways that would make our worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Tonight we're going to meet the Homo habilis, the handyman, our distant relatives who lived lives so brutal, so short, and so filled with terror that by the end of this story you'll never complain about your Monday morning commute again. So get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, because what I'm about to tell you might just keep you awake for all the right reasons. And if you find yourself completely absorbed in this tale of ancient horror and survival, well, there's a little subscribe button down there. But only hit it if you genuinely love diving deep into these forgotten chapters of human history. I'm not here to beg, I'm here to tell stories that matter. Chapter 1. Welcome to your new life, or what's left of it. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, but instead of your warm bed and your smartphone alarm, you're lying on the hard ground of ancient Africa. The sun hasn't risen yet, and in the darkness you hear sounds that make your blood run cold. A low growl in the distance, the crack of a branch, the splash of something large moving through water. You try to sit up, but something's wrong. You're much smaller than you were yesterday, barely 4 feet tall. Your arms are longer, your face projects forward, and your brain, well, your brain is operating with about half the processing power you're used to. Congratulations. You've just woken up as a Homo habilis, and statistically speaking, you have about 12 years to live, if you're lucky. But here's the truly terrifying part, that 12-year estimate. It's probably generous. See, when scientists studied 26 random Homo habilis specimens, they noticed something chilling. There was a suspicious lack of babies and very young children in the fossil record. Not because they didn't exist, but because they died so young and so frequently that their tiny bones rarely had time to fossilize. The real average lifespan was likely closer to 8 or 9 years. Let that sink in for a moment. While you're sitting there probably in your teens, 20s, 30s, or beyond, imagine that your entire existence, every memory, every relationship, every experience, would need to be crammed into less time than it takes to finish elementary school. But why were their lives so impossibly short? What made existence so brutal that the majority of individuals never even reached what we would consider childhood? The answer lies in a perfect storm of evolutionary disadvantages, environmental hostility, and pure unadulterated bad luck. Let's start with the basics. Homo habilis emerged roughly 2.3 million years ago in East and South Africa. They were among the first of our genus, the genus Homo, which sounds prestigious until you realize they were essentially the beta version of humanity, complete with all the bugs and fatal flaws you'd expect from an early release. These early humans were small, remarkably small. The average Homo habilis stood less than 4 feet tall and weighed perhaps 70-80 pounds when fully grown. To put that in perspective, they were about the size of a modern 10-year-old child, but without any of the protection that modern children enjoy. Now, being small isn't necessarily a death sentence. Many small animals thrive by being quick, clever, or well hidden, but Homo habilis was none of these things effectively. They weren't particularly fast runners. Their legs were still somewhat adapted for climbing rather than pure terrestrial locomotion. They weren't especially clever compared to what came after them, with brains roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's. And they certainly weren't well hidden, because their lifestyle demanded that they venture into the most dangerous places imaginable. You see, Homo habilis had developed a taste for meat, not just any meat. They were scavengers, which meant they had to approach recently killed animals to steal what they could before the real predators noticed. Imagine being a 70-pound creature trying to sneak meat away from a pride of lions, or worse, the creatures we're going to meet later in this story. Their bodies told the story of this dangerous lifestyle. Their jaws were massive compared to their skulls, thick, powerful mandibles that could generate incredible bite force for their size. Their teeth included enlarged incisors designed specifically for cutting through meat and tough plant material. These weren't the teeth of peaceful fruit eaters. These were the tools of creatures who had to fight for every calorie. But here's where the cosmic joke really kicks in. All of these adaptations for a meat-rich diet meant they had to leave the relative safety of the trees regularly, and the world below was not kind to small, slow, poorly armed primates with big appetites. The average day for a Homo habilis would have been an exercise in calculated risk-taking that would make extreme sports look like Sunday picnics. Wake up in your tree, climb down to search for water and food, try not to get killed by any of the dozens of predators actively hunting you, find a carcass, fight off other scavengers, eat as quickly as possible, try to make it back to safety before something else notices you, and if you survived that day, congratulations, you got to do it all again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until your luck ran out, which for most individuals happened embarrassingly quickly, but were just getting started, because the small size and poor design were just the foundation of their misery. The real nightmare was what was waiting for them out there in the ancient world, predators so numerous, so diverse, and so perfectly adapted for killing small primates that it's honestly amazing any Homo habilis lived long enough to reproduce. So settle in, because we're about to meet the monsters. Chapter 2. The Saber-Toothed Nightmare Factory. If you were a Homo habilis, there was one sound that would make your blood freeze in your veins, the soft patting of large paws on ancient African soil. Because when you heard that sound, it likely meant that one of several species of saber-toothed cats had caught your scent. Let me introduce you to your worst nightmare. Meganterion. Picture, if you will, a cat about the size of a modern jaguar, but built like a tank and armed like a medieval torture device. Meganterion wasn't just any predator, it was a specialist in killing primates exactly like you. The first thing you'd notice about a Meganterion, assuming you lived long enough to notice anything, would be its absolutely massive front paws. These weren't delicate cat paws, these were lion-sized instruments of death attached to a jaguar-sized body. Each paw came equipped with recurved claws that were essentially biological grappling hooks, designed to sink into flesh and never let go. Once those claws found purchase in your 70-pound frame, escape was no longer an option. The Meganterion would then bring its true weapons to bear, a mouthful of serrated teeth anchored by two enormous saber teeth that were perfectly designed for one purpose, severing the major arteries and nerves in your neck. Now here's where it gets really horrifying. We know exactly how these attacks played out, because paleontologists have found Homo habilis remains with very specific types of damage. In most cases, the kill was probably quick. Those massive canines would slide between vertebrae or pierce major blood vessels, leading to unconsciousness within seconds. But sometimes things went differently. There's one particular fossil that haunts researchers, a Homo habilis skull with puncture marks on the back of the head. But here's the twisted part. The angle of the bite marks indicates that the attack came from the front, not the back, which means the Meganterion had managed to fit the entire human's head inside its mouth. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a bite, this was a complete engulfment of a human being's head. The saber teeth would puncture the back of the skull, while the front of the jaw covered the nose and mouth. It was simultaneous skull damage, brain trauma, and suffocation, a triple-threat execution method that would make medieval torturers jealous. But the truly depressing part, Meganterion wasn't even trying that hard. Analysis of their isotopic signatures, basically the chemical fingerprint left in their bones, shows that they ate Homo habilis so frequently that it actually changed their body chemistry. These cats were literally made of our ancestors, and Meganterion wasn't alone. Meet Dinofelis, another saber-toothed nightmare that shared the same hunting grounds. Dinofelis was smaller but arguably more terrifying because it was specifically adapted for hunting primates. Its entire evolutionary strategy revolved around killing creatures like Homo habilis. Its teeth, its claws, its hunting style, everything was fine-tuned for primate murder. Then there was Homotherium, the scimitar cat. If Meganterion was a stabbing weapon, Homotherium was a slashing one. Its saber teeth were shorter but broader, with serrated edges that created a unique bite pattern. They would puncture and slice simultaneously, like being attacked by a biological switchblade. But the absolute worst of the worst, the final boss of saber-toothed cats, was Machairodus. Machairodus was one of the largest felids that ever lived. Some species reached 400 kilograms, that's nearly 900 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's comparable to a male polar bear or a fully grown Smilodon fatalis. Now imagine that level of mass, muscle, and killing power, but with the intelligence and hunting instincts of a big cat. A single paw swipe from Machirotus could literally shatter every bone in a Homo habilis body. And here's the really unfair part. Despite its massive size, Machirotus was actually a better jumper than many smaller, more agile cats. Its hunting strategy relied on powerful leaps rather than long chases, which meant that escape by climbing was virtually impossible. Those tree climbing abilities that Homo habilis relied on, completely useless against a predator that could jump higher than they could climb. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely these attacks were rare occurrences, right? Surely most Homo habilis died of natural causes or old age. Oh, you sweet naive modern human. We haven't even gotten to the hyenas yet. While the saber-toothed cats were busy perfecting the art of the individual kill, hyenas were taking a completely different approach: psychological warfare and group torture. There were two types of hyenas that made life hell for Homo habilis, and each one specialized in a different flavor of nightmare. First we have Pachacrucata, and just the name should tell you everything you need to know. This was one of the largest hyenas of all time. Imagine a modern lion, but with the bone-crushing bite force of a hyena cranked up to 11. Pachacrucata had literally one of the strongest pound-for-pound bite forces of any terrestrial mammal that ever lived. That bite force wasn't just for show, it was specifically designed to crack open bones and access the marrow inside. Now this created a direct conflict with Homo habilis, because bone marrow was one of their primary food sources. So picture this scenario: you've spent hours trying to access the marrow from a bone using your primitive stone tools, and just as you're about to enjoy your hard-earned meal, a lion-sized hyena shows up with the ability to crack that same bone in a single bite. But the real horror of Pachacrucata wasn't just their size or their bite force, it was their feeding behavior. Like modern hyenas, they almost certainly ate their prey alive, and when you're dealing with a pack-hunting species that can crush bones with their jaws, being eaten alive takes on a whole new meaning. The other hyena species, Chasmoporthetes, was smaller but in many ways more terrifying. This was what paleontologists call a dog-like hyena, more gracile, more nimble, and designed for extreme speed. They called it the running hyena because its limb structure was remarkably similar to a cheetah's. Now think about that for a second. Homo habilis could barely run at all. They were built for endurance walking at best. So imagine being chased by a pack of cheetah-fast hyenas. There's no outrunning them, there's no hiding from them, and there's definitely no fighting them off because they hunted in large groups. Chasmoporthetes was also a hypercarnivore, meaning over 70% of their diet was meat, pure meat, and their teeth reflected this diet, razor-sharp cutting edges shaped surprisingly like those of big cats, but arranged in the jaw of a pack-hunting animal with the intelligence to coordinate complex attacks. The feeding behavior of these creatures would have been particularly traumatic for any Homo habilis, unlucky enough to be caught alive. Modern hyenas are known to begin feeding before their prey is dead, starting with the softer parts, the belly, the face, the genitals. Now multiply that horror by an entire pack of cheetah-fast hyenas, and you begin to understand why the average lifespan of Homo habilis was so devastatingly short. But as bad as the land predators were, they paled in comparison to what was waiting in the water.
Chapter 3: The Human-Eating Dragons of Ancient Africa. Now I need you to imagine the one place a tiny vulnerable Homo habilis might feel relatively safe: water, right? Predators can't climb trees to reach you, and most land animals won't follow you into deep water. Well, that logic would have gotten you killed in ancient Africa, because the waterways were home to some of the largest, most aggressive crocodiles that ever lived, and one of them had a name that should make your skin crawl: Crocodilus anthropophagus, the human eater. This wasn't just a nickname given by modern scientists with a sense of drama. This crocodile literally specialized in eating people. We have direct evidence of its human diet because paleontologists have found multiple Homo habilis remains with damage that perfectly matches the teeth of Anthropophagus. Picture a saltwater crocodile, already one of the most terrifying predators alive today. Now make it 25% larger. Crocodilus anthropophagus reached lengths of 7.5 meters, that's nearly 25 feet, and weighed around 1.5 tons. To put that in perspective, the longest crocodile ever recorded in modern times was Lo Long, at 20 feet and 1.1 tons. This ancient monster made Lo Long look like a baby, but size wasn't even the most terrifying thing about Anthropophagus. It was their hunting strategy. These crocodiles were ambush predators that specifically targeted the legs of their prey during lightning-fast attacks from the water. They would grab a Homo habilis by the leg or foot, then either drown them or use the infamous death roll to literally rip their limbs off. We know this because 2 juvenile Homo habilis fossils were found with severe damage to their legs and feet that perfectly matched the bite pattern of Anthropophagus. In both cases, the limbs had been completely torn away from the body. These children died by having their legs ripped off by a 25-foot crocodile, and to make matters worse, Anthropophagus came equipped with what can only be described as demonic features. Above each eye sat prominent bony ridges, essentially horns that made this creature look like something out of a nightmare, even before it opened its mouth. When Homo habilis looked into the water and saw those horn-like projections breaking the surface, they knew they were looking at death itself. But Anthropophagus wasn't even the biggest crocodile lurking in African waters. That honor belonged to Crocodilus thorbjarnarsoni, which reached lengths of up to 8 meters over 26 feet, making it the largest crocodilian species ever discovered. Thorbjarnarsoni had a skull that was not only massive but also unusually broad compared to modern crocodiles, possibly adapted for crushing heavily armored prey like giant turtles. But it was also an opportunistic feeder, which meant that any Homo habilis who ventured too close to water was on the menu. Here's what makes this even more terrifying. Homo habilis loved fish. They were among the first humans to regularly include fish in their diet, which meant they had to spend time near water. A lot of time. They would wade into rivers and lakes, probably using their hands to catch fish in the shallows, completely unaware that they were essentially serving themselves up as appetizers to creatures that could bite them in half. The fossil record tells us stories that would make modern horror movies seem tame. Take specimen OH7, one of the most complete Homo habilis fossils we have. This individual shows evidence of not just one predator attack, but 2 separate attacks by 2 different types of predators. The first attack came from a giant crocodile. Deep, broad puncture wounds on the foot and leg bones match perfectly with the teeth of a massive croc, and just like the other specimens, this individual lost their limb to a death roll or drowning attack. But here's where it gets really crazy. OH7 also shows evidence of attack by a large mammalian carnivore. Shallow groove marks on the skull don't match any crocodile bite, but they bear an uncanny resemblance to the bite pattern of a large cat, probably something leopard-sized or larger. So this poor individual was attacked by both a giant crocodile and a large cat. We don't know if these were separate incidents or if this was some kind of horrific feeding frenzy, but either way, it paints a picture of a world where death could come from any direction at any time. And remember, this is just what we can see in the fossil record. For every fossil that preserved evidence of predator attacks, there were probably dozens or hundreds of individuals who were completely consumed, leaving no trace behind. The waterways of ancient Africa weren't just dangerous. They were essentially death traps lined with massive intelligent predators who had millions of years to perfect the art of killing small mammals. And unfortunately for Homo habilis, their diet and lifestyle meant they couldn't avoid water. But as terrifying as these aquatic dragons were, they were just one part of a much larger ecosystem of death. Because ancient Africa wasn't just home to giant crocodiles, it was home to creatures that would make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams.
Chapter 4. The Serpent's Shadow. When death slithered. You know that feeling when you're walking through tall grass and you suddenly freeze, convinced you saw something move out of the corner of your eye? That primal fear that shoots up your spine and makes every hair on your body stand on end? That fear exists for a reason, and for Homo habilis it was a matter of daily survival. Ancient Africa was home to snakes that would make today's most venomous species look like garden worms. And the relationship between early humans and serpents was so adversarial, so deadly, that some scientists believe it literally shaped our evolution. Think about it. Why are humans naturally afraid of snakes? Why do we have such incredible visual processing for detecting snake-like patterns? Why can we spot a curved stick that resembles a snake from incredible distances? Some researchers believe it's because our ancestors who couldn't detect camouflaged snakes, well, they didn't become ancestors. For Homo habilis, this evolutionary arms race was still in its early stages, which meant they had the fear but not necessarily the refined detection abilities that would develop in later human species. They were caught in that terrible middle ground, smart enough to know snakes were dangerous but not quite evolved enough to reliably avoid them, and the snakes of ancient Africa were not messing around. We don't have direct fossil evidence of snake attacks on Homo habilis. Snake bite marks don't preserve well in bone, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about snake-human interactions today. In modern Africa, venomous snakes cause tens of thousands of deaths every year, even with access to hospitals, anti-venom, and modern medicine. For a Homo habilis with none of these advantages, a venomous snake bite was essentially a death sentence with a built-in timer. But it wasn't just the venomous species that were problematic. Large constricting snakes, pythons, and their relatives were equally deadly and probably more common. Modern research on uncontacted tribes shows that attacks by large constricting snakes remain one of the highest sources of mortality for certain isolated groups, even today. Picture this scenario. You're a young Homo habilis, maybe 8 or 9 years old, practically elderly by your species standards. You're foraging for fruits in an area with dense vegetation, moving carefully through the undergrowth because you've learned that sudden movements attract predators. You reach for what looks like a promising piece of fruit, and suddenly the branch you're pushing aside isn't a branch at all. It's the thick, muscular body of a 20-foot python. In the modern world, if you're attacked by a large python, you might have a chance if you know what you're doing, if you have help nearby, if you have tools. But as a Homo habilis, you have none of these advantages. Your small size actually works against you. There's less of you to compress before vital organs start shutting down. The death wouldn't be quick. Pythons don't crush their prey, they cut off blood flow. Every time you exhale, the snake tightens its grip slightly, preventing you from taking a full breath back in. Over the course of minutes, you slowly suffocate, while fully conscious, completely aware of what's happening, but powerless to stop it. And here's what makes it even worse. Snakes don't just swallow you and get it over with. Large pythons will often reposition their prey multiple times to ensure they can swallow head first. So you might survive the initial constriction, only to experience the additional horror of being slowly swallowed alive. But even if you somehow managed to avoid the giant constrictors, the venomous species presented their own unique varieties of doom. Ancient Africa was home to relatives of modern mambas, cobras, and vipers, but likely in larger sizes and with more potent venoms than their modern descendants. A bite from a relative of the black mamba would cause rapid paralysis and respiratory failure. You'd remain conscious while your nervous system shut down piece by piece. Cobra relatives would cause tissue necrosis around the bite site, essentially rotting your flesh while you were still alive, followed by systemic organ failure. Viper relatives would cause massive internal bleeding. You'd essentially bleed to death from the inside while experiencing excruciating pain. And remember, all of this is happening to creatures who live primarily in trees and dense vegetation, exactly where snakes excel at ambush hunting. Every branch could be a serpent, every shadow could hide death, every rustling leaf could signal the end. The psychological toll alone must have been overwhelming. Imagine living in a state of constant hypervigilance, where every step could be your last, where every sound could indicate mortal danger, where even the places you go to seek shelter are filled with predators specifically adapted to hunt creatures like you. But as we're about to see, snakes were just one thread in a tapestry of terror that surrounded Homo habilis every moment of their short lives, because we haven't even talked about what happened when they tried to defend themselves, or when they encountered other human species who were bigger, smarter, and better armed. The ancient world wasn't just dangerous, it was actively hostile to the existence of these small, vulnerable early humans, and unfortunately for them, we're still just scratching the surface of their misery. Chapter 5. When your own family wants you dead. Here's something that might keep you awake at night. What if the most dangerous predators weren't cats or crocodiles or hyenas? What if the most dangerous predators were other humans? For Homo habilis, this wasn't just a hypothetical nightmare. It was daily reality. Because they weren't the only human species roaming ancient Africa. In fact, they shared their hunting grounds with not one, not two, but 3 other human species, plus another close relative, and the relationships between these groups were complicated. Let me introduce you to the neighbors: Homo erectus, Homo rudolfensis, Australopithecus garhi, and Paranthropus boisei. Now, in an ideal world, you might expect these related species to coexist peacefully, maybe even cooperatively. After all, they faced many of the same environmental challenges and predators. But evolution doesn't create ideal worlds. It creates competition, fierce, often deadly competition for limited resources. And Homo habilis was woefully outmatched in almost every conceivable way. First, there was the size difference. Remember, Homo habilis averaged under 4 feet tall and weighed maybe 70–80 pounds. Homo erectus, their closest human relative, was significantly larger and more robust. Some erectus individuals could reach modern human sizes, making them nearly twice as large as their habilis cousins. But size wasn't the only disadvantage. There was also the brain gap. Homo habilis had an average brain size of 506,887 cubic centimeters. That might sound respectable until you realize that Homo rudolfensis had brains that were 25% larger, and Homo erectus sometimes had brains that were literally double the size. This intelligence gap translated into a massive technological disadvantage that would have been immediately obvious to anyone witnessing a confrontation between these groups. While Homo habilis was struggling with simple stone tools, basically rocks that had been chipped into slightly more useful shapes, Homo erectus had developed sophisticated technology that included controlled fire, advanced cutting implements, and specialized hunting weapons. Picture this. You're a Homo habilis with your crude stone chopper, and you encounter a group of Homo erectus carrying fire-hardened wooden spears, sharp stone knives, and hand axes with perfectly symmetrical cutting edges. It's not just a technological gap, it's the difference between a Bronze Age warrior and someone fighting with a pointed stick, and we know these encounters sometimes turned violent. There's direct evidence that Homo habilis killed and possibly ate Paranthropus boise. We've found Paranthropus remains with clear-cut marks that match Homo habilis tools. But here's the thing, Paranthropus was actually larger and more robust than Homo habilis, with massive jaw muscles and crushing bite force. If Homo habilis was willing and able to kill Paranthropus, what do you think happened when they encountered other Homo species that were even larger, smarter, and better armed? The evidence suggests that interspecies violence was not uncommon. In a world where food was scarce and competition was fierce, related human species weren't family, they were competitors for the same limited resources. And in that competition, being smallest, weakest, and least technologically advanced was a death sentence. Think about the psychology of this situation. As a Homo habilis, you're not just afraid of lions and crocodiles, you're also afraid of creatures that look almost like you, that share your basic body plan and behaviors, but are bigger, stronger, and smarter. It's like being stalked by superior versions of yourself. And then there was the territorial issue. Multiple human species trying to occupy the same ecological niche is a recipe for conflict. Water sources, fruit trees, good scavenging sites, safe sleeping areas, all of these resources would have been contested between groups, but here's where it gets really dark. We know that Homo habilis practiced scavenging, but they also practiced something else that's evident in the archaeological record: cannibalism. Cut marks on Homo habilis bones suggest that they sometimes ate each other. Now this might have been ritualistic, or it might have been survival cannibalism during times of extreme food scarcity, but either way, it indicates that violence within the species was not uncommon. If Homo habilis groups were willing to kill and eat each other, interspecies violence with other human groups would have been practically inevitable, and in those conflicts, Homo habilis would almost always be the losers. Imagine the psychological toll of living in a world where even creatures that share your basic humanity are potential threats, where the sight of other upright walking bipeds doesn't bring relief or hope of cooperation, but fear and the possibility of violent death. This is the world that Homo habilis inhabited every single day, a world where safety didn't exist, where trust was impossible, where even your own species might be your enemy. But believe it or not, we still haven't reached the bottom of this nightmare, because in addition to all the predators, all the hostile human species, all the environmental dangers, Homo habilis had to deal with something that was slowly killing them from the inside, their own bodies. Chapter 6. Betrayed by Biology. When your own body is the enemy, you wake up one morning as a Homo habilis, and your jaw aches. This isn't unusual. Your jaw always aches these days. You run your tongue over your teeth and feel the familiar sharp edges where chunks have broken off, the rough surfaces where the enamel has worn completely away. You're 15 years old, which makes you practically ancient by your species standards, but your teeth look like those of a modern 80-year-old who's never heard of dental hygiene. Here's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Homo habilis existence. Their own bodies were actively working against their survival, and nowhere was this more evident than in their mouths. Of the 26 Homo habilis specimens that researchers studied in detail, only about 40% had what could generously be called decent teeth. The remaining 60% showed severe wear, chips, cracks, and enamel loss that would be shocking in a modern context. But here's the really devastating part. The oldest specimen in this study was only 25 years old. These weren't ancient individuals who had lived long lives and gradually worn down their teeth. These were young adults and even children with dental problems so severe that eating would have been a daily agony. One 17-year-old specimen, remember 17 was practically geriatric for this species, had dental wear that was twice as bad as what you'd expect to see in a modern elderly human with poor dental hygiene. A teenager with the teeth of a neglected 90-year-old. And it gets worse. Multiple specimens under 10 years old already showed major dental problems. Children who should have been playing and learning were instead dealing with constant tooth pain that would have made eating difficult and sleeping nearly impossible. The cause of this dental catastrophe was their diet, but it wasn't just the meat. Homo habilis was eating a combination of scavenged flesh, cracked bones for marrow, and tough plant material that their teeth simply weren't designed to handle long term. Every meal was slowly destroying their ability to process future meals. And because they were scavengers rather than primary hunters, they didn't get first choice of food. They had to eat whatever was left after the real predators had taken their fill, often the toughest, most difficult to process parts that other animals had abandoned. Imagine being constantly hungry, but every bite of food causes excruciating pain in your mouth. Imagine trying to chew tough meat with cracked, broken teeth, feeling shards of enamel cutting into your gums with every jaw movement, and knowing that tomorrow, and every day after that, it's only going to get worse. This dental deterioration created a vicious cycle. As their teeth became more damaged, Homo habilis individuals would have had to spend more time processing food, making them more vulnerable to predator attacks. They would have been less efficient at extracting nutrition from their meals, leading to malnutrition that would weaken their already small bodies even further. And the dental problems were just the beginning of their biological betrayals. Their small size made them vulnerable to injuries that larger humans could easily survive. A fall from a tree that might bruise a modern human could easily break bones in a 70-pound Homo habilis frame, and falls were inevitable. Despite being partially arboreal, spending significant time in trees, Homo habilis wasn't nearly as well adapted for climbing as chimpanzees. They had the worst of both worlds. They needed to climb to escape predators, but they were poorly designed for it. Even modern chimps, who are perfectly adapted for arboreal life, typically experience at least one major fall during their lifetime. For Homo habilis, with their imperfect climbing adaptations, serious falls would have been even more common. A broken leg or arm for a Homo habilis wasn't just an injury, it was a death sentence. There was no medical care, no splints, no period of protected recovery. A major injury meant you couldn't climb trees to escape predators, couldn't run from danger, couldn't effectively forage for food. You became easy prey for any predator that happened to be in the area. Their immune systems were another major weakness. Without the sophisticated immune responses that would develop in later human species, Homo habilis would have been vulnerable to parasites, bacterial infections, and diseases that would barely affect modern humans. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death. Intestinal parasites from their scavenged meat diet could cause chronic malnutrition and weakness. Respiratory infections during the cold periods could be fatal for individuals who were already operating on minimal caloric reserves. And speaking of calories, their high-risk, low-reward lifestyle meant they were probably chronically undernourished. The energy expenditure required to avoid predators, compete for food sources, and maintain their partially arboreal lifestyle was enormous compared to their ability to secure reliable nutrition. There's something profoundly tragic about creatures whose own bodies were sabotaging their survival. Every biological system that should have protected them was instead creating new vulnerabilities. Their small size made them prey. Their dietary needs forced them into danger. Their climbing abilities were just good enough to get them into trees, but not good enough to keep them safe there. It's as if evolution had created the perfect victim, intelligent enough to suffer, but not intelligent enough to effectively defend itself. Strong enough to survive birth, but not strong enough to survive childhood. Adaptable enough to exploit new food sources, but not adaptable enough to avoid the dangers that came with them. But we're not done with the biological betrayals yet, because there was one more aspect of their physiology that made survival even more difficult: their reproductive strategy. In a world where most individuals died before reaching adolescence, successful reproduction required reaching sexual maturity quickly and producing offspring early and often. This created enormous metabolic demands on bodies that were already struggling to meet their basic nutritional needs. Pregnancy and child rearing in such a hostile environment would have been almost impossibly difficult. Pregnant females would have been even more vulnerable to predator attacks, and caring for infants would have required resources that were already desperately scarce. The cruel mathematics of Homo habilis existence meant that most individuals died before they could reproduce, but those who did manage to reproduce often died in the process or shortly afterward. It was a biological system perfectly designed to perpetuate suffering across generations, and all of this biological misery was playing out against a backdrop of environmental hostility that seemed specifically designed to make their lives as difficult as possible. Chapter 7. When the Earth itself turned against them. Imagine if tomorrow, the climate where you live suddenly became completely unpredictable. One year, it's a desert. The next year, it's freezing cold. Then back to scorching heat. Then drought. Then floods. And this pattern continues for hundreds of thousands of years, making it impossible to adapt to any stable conditions. This was the environmental nightmare that Homo habilis faced during their existence. During the Pliocene period, when Homo habilis was struggling to survive in East and South Africa, the continent was experiencing what scientists call intense climatic fluctuations. This wasn't just normal weather variation. This was systematic environmental chaos that made stable food sources nearly impossible to maintain. The climate would swing from relatively warm and wet periods, which supported lush vegetation and abundant wildlife. During the arid periods, water sources would dry up, forcing all the remaining wildlife to concentrate around the few remaining rivers and lakes. Now remember what we learned about those waterways. They were death traps filled with giant crocodiles. But during droughts, Homo habilis had no choice but to risk encounters with these aquatic predators, because the alternative was death by dehydration. The vegetation would also change dramatically during these climatic swings. Fruit trees that had provided reliable nutrition would die off or stop producing. Edible plants would become scarce. The landscape itself would transform from a challenging but manageable environment into a barren wasteland that couldn't support large populations of any species. This climatic instability created what researchers call systematic starvation events, essentially periods where there simply wasn't enough food in the environment to support the existing populations of animals, including Homo habilis. During these starvation periods, several things would happen that made life even more dangerous for our ancestors. First, competition for the remaining food sources would become absolutely ruthless. Every scrap of meat, every piece of fruit, every accessible water source would be fiercely contested. Second, the predators would become more aggressive and more desperate. A hungry lion is a dangerous lion, but a starving lion is a completely different level of threat. The same applied to all the other carnivores that hunted Homo habilis. Hunger would make them more willing to take risks, more aggressive in their attacks, and more likely to target any available prey, no matter how well defended. Third, the Homo habilis groups themselves would have been forced to take increasingly dangerous risks to find food. This meant venturing further from safe areas, spending more time in predator-rich environments, and competing more directly with other human species for scarce resources. The archaeological evidence suggests that as the climate worsened, Homo habilis populations became increasingly dependent on scavenged meat to supplement their caloric intake. But this created a deadly feedback loop. The more they relied on scavenging, the more time they spent near carcasses, which meant more encounters with the predators that were also attracted to those same food sources. And here's where the environmental crisis becomes particularly heartbreaking. The fossil record shows clear evidence that Homo habilis populations were aware of their predicament and were trying to adapt. There's evidence of what might be one of the earliest human-built structures, a rough windbreak or shelter that dates to about 1.7 million years ago. If this was indeed built by Homo habilis, it represents a desperate attempt to deal with the increasingly harsh climate conditions they were facing. Think about what it must have been like to be intelligent enough to recognize that your environment was becoming more hostile, but not intelligent enough to develop effective solutions. To know that your children were dying at unprecedented rates, that your food sources were disappearing, that the very climate was turning against you, but to be powerless to do anything meaningful about it. The climatic changes also affected their reproductive success in devastating ways. During the worst periods, pregnant females would have struggled to find adequate nutrition, leading to higher rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality. The few children who were successfully born would have entered a world where food was scarce and predators were desperate. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the climate crisis was how it highlighted the fundamental vulnerability of their survival strategy. Homo habilis had evolved a lifestyle that depended on a relatively stable environment, with predictable food sources and water availability. When that environmental stability disappeared, their entire way of life became unsustainable. They were caught in what evolutionary biologists call an extinction vortex, a situation where environmental pressures create a downward spiral that becomes impossible to escape. Smaller populations are more vulnerable to environmental changes, which leads to even smaller populations, which makes them even more vulnerable, and so on. And as if random climatic chaos wasn't enough, the changing environment was also altering the behavior and distribution of all those predators we've been talking about. Drought conditions would force normally solitary predators to share territory, increasing competition and aggression. Scarce water sources would create killing fields where predators would wait for prey to come to them. The giant crocodiles would have been concentrated in the few remaining water sources, making those areas even more dangerous. The saber-toothed cats would have been hungrier and more desperate. The hyenas would have been more aggressive in defending carcasses. Every environmental change seemed to create new ways for Homo habilis to die. It was as if the planet itself had declared war on their species, using climate, predators, disease, and starvation as weapons in a campaign of systematic extermination. But we still haven't talked about the most psychologically devastating aspect of Homo habilis existence, because beyond all the external threats, beyond all the environmental challenges, beyond all the biological disadvantages, there was something else that made their lives uniquely horrible. They were just smart enough to know how bad things were.
Chapter 8. The Curse of Consciousness. Smart enough to suffer. Ranor. There's a special kind of horror reserved for creatures who are intelligent enough to understand their predicament, but not intelligent enough to escape it. And that's exactly where Homo habilis found themselves in the evolutionary timeline. Think about what it means to have consciousness in a world designed to kill you. Modern humans deal with existential dread about mortality, but we have philosophy, religion, art, and science to help us process these feelings. We can find meaning in suffering, hope in community, and purpose in progress. Homo habilis had none of these coping mechanisms. They had just enough intelligence to recognize patterns, to know that predators hunted in certain areas, to understand that some foods were safer than others, to realize that their children were dying at horrific rates, but they didn't have enough intelligence to develop effective solutions to these problems. Picture the psychological state of a Homo habilis parent watching their child sicken and die, knowing there's nothing they can do to help. Or imagine the terror of recognizing the signs of an approaching predator, understanding exactly what's about to happen, but being powerless to prevent it. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness, taken to its most extreme conclusion. Homo habilis would have learned very early in life that death was not just possible but probable, and that their actions had very little impact on their survival outcomes. And here's where their partial arboreal lifestyle becomes even more tragic. They were intelligent enough to recognize that trees provided safety from many ground predators, but not intelligent enough to become fully arboreal like their chimpanzee relatives. They were caught between two worlds, no longer apes, but not yet fully human. This evolutionary limbo meant they had the worst aspects of both lifestyles. They were too large and clumsy to be truly safe in trees, but too small and weak to be safe on the ground. Every choice they made was a compromise that increased their vulnerability. Let me tell you about the daily psychological reality of being a Homo habilis. You wake up every morning knowing that this might be the day you die. Not in an abstract philosophical sense like modern humans, but in an immediate statistical sense. You know that most individuals like you don't live to see their next birthday. You know that your parents probably died young. You know that your children, if you have any, will probably die young too. But you also know just enough to try to prevent it. You'll spend your day making calculations. Is it safer to forage alone or in a group? Should you try to access that tempting fruit tree even though there were predator tracks nearby yesterday? Is that water source worth the risk, or should you try to survive another day without drinking? Every decision is a gamble with death as the stakes. And your brain, primitive though it might be compared to later humans, is sophisticated enough to understand the magnitude of these risks while being too limited to effectively mitigate them. This creates a state of chronic intense stress that would have been literally toxic to their developing brains and bodies. Modern research shows that chronic stress hormones can stunt growth,
impair immune function, and accelerate aging. For Homo habilis, living in a constant state of life or death alertness would have been slowly poisoning them even when they managed to avoid immediate threats. And then there's the social aspect of this psychological nightmare. Homo habilis lived in groups of up to 85 individuals, which means they formed social bonds, they cared about each other, they experienced grief when group members died, but group members died constantly. Imagine forming an emotional attachment to someone, knowing that they'll probably be dead within a few years. Imagine trying to raise children while knowing that statistically most of them won't survive to adulthood. Imagine the compound grief of watching friends, family members, and offspring die over and over again, while knowing that you're almost certainly next. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was their awareness of their own physical limitations. Homo habilis would have been able to observe other human species, larger, stronger, more technologically advanced groups that were clearly better adapted for survival. They would have seen Homo erectus with their controlled fire and sophisticated tools, and they would have understood on some level that they were inferior. This wasn't just physical inferiority, it was technological and cognitive inferiority that they could observe but couldn't overcome. Imagine being smart enough to recognize that other groups had better weapons, better strategies, better survival rates, but not smart enough to replicate those advantages yourself. The archaeological evidence suggests that Homo habilis attempted to learn from and copy the technologies of other human species, but they were always several steps behind. Their tools remained crude while other groups developed increasingly sophisticated implements. Their survival strategies remained reactive while other groups became proactive. They were trapped in a cognitive valley, too intelligent to live like simple animals without awareness of their mortality, but not intelligent enough to transcend their biological limitations through technology and culture. And then there was the loneliness. In a world where every other creature was either a predator, a competitor, or prey, true cooperation and trust would have been nearly impossible. Even within their own groups, the constant threat of death would have made forming deep, lasting relationships emotionally dangerous. Why invest in friendships when your friends are statistically likely to be killed within the next few years? Why develop complex social structures when your society is constantly being decimated by predation and environmental catastrophe? Modern humans sometimes romanticize the idea of simpler times when our ancestors lived closer to nature, but for Homo habilis, nature wasn't a nurturing mother. It was an actively hostile force that seemed designed to maximize suffering while minimizing any possibility of escape or transcendence. They were conscious enough to dream of safety, but not capable enough to achieve it. They were social enough to form bonds, but those bonds were constantly being severed by violence and death. They were intelligent enough to recognize their problems, but not intelligent enough to solve them. In many ways, Homo habilis represents consciousness at its most tragic: awareness without agency, intelligence without power, hope without realistic possibility of fulfillment. And as we're about to see, even their brief moments of success and technological innovation only serve to highlight how utterly hopeless their situation really was. Chapter 9. False Hope. When success only made things worse. You know what's almost more heartbreaking than complete helplessness? It's getting just close enough to success to taste it, only to have it make your situation worse. And that's exactly what happened with Homo habilis and their technological achievements. See, Homo habilis weren't complete failures. They earned their name handyman because they were among the first humans to systematically create and use stone tools. They developed what archaeologists call the Oldowan tool culture, which represented a genuine breakthrough in human technology. These weren't just randomly chipped rocks. These were deliberately crafted implements with sharp edges, designed for specific purposes: cutting meat, cracking bones, processing plant material. For creatures with brains the size of chimpanzees, this represented remarkable innovation and planning ability. And it worked. Sort of. These tools gave Homo habilis access to new food sources, particularly bone marrow, which was rich in the fats and nutrients needed to support their relatively large brains. They could process carcasses more efficiently than their predecessors, extracting nutrition from parts of animals that other scavengers couldn't access. But here's where their success became their curse. Better tools meant they could exploit more dangerous food sources, which meant they had to venture into more dangerous areas more frequently. Before stone tools, a Homo habilis might have avoided a particular carcass because it was too close to predator territory or too difficult to process quickly. With stone tools, that same carcass became an attractive target. They could cut away chunks of meat rapidly, crack bones for marrow, and process tough plant materials that had been inedible before. This technological advancement essentially expanded their ecological niche, but into the most dangerous parts of the ecosystem. The ability to process carcasses more efficiently meant they were spending more time around dead animals, which is exactly where predators like to hang out. The ability to access bone marrow put them in direct competition with hyenas, who were much better equipped for that particular arms race. The ability to process tough plant materials meant they were foraging in areas with more dangerous vegetation and wildlife. Every technological success opened up new opportunities that came with exponentially increased risks. And then there was the social aspect of their technological achievements. Stone tool production requires planning, teaching, and coordination. Homo habilis had to work together to find suitable stone, to learn and transmit knapping techniques, to coordinate tool use during scavenging expeditions. This increased social cooperation was probably beneficial for group survival, but it also created new vulnerabilities. Larger, more coordinated groups are more visible to predators. They make more noise, leave more tracks, and require more resources to sustain. So the archaeological evidence suggests that Homo habilis lived in groups of up to 85 individuals, much larger than typical chimpanzee communities. While this provided some protection through numbers, it also created what ecologists call resource pressure. A group of 85 individuals needs vastly more food, water, and territory than smaller groups, which meant they couldn't avoid dangerous areas even if they wanted to. Large groups also move more slowly and are less stealthy than individuals or small groups. When you're being hunted by predators that rely on surprise attacks, being part of a large, noisy, slow-moving group is not an advantage. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of their technological success was how it highlighted their limitations. They were smart enough to make tools, but not smart enough to make good tools. They could create sharp edges, but not spear points. They could crack bones, but not create effective weapons for defense. Meanwhile, they were watching other human species develop increasingly sophisticated technologies. Homo erectus had controlled fire, which provided warmth, protection, and the ability to cook food. They had symmetrical hand axes that represented a level of planning and skill that Homo habilis never achieved. They had specialized hunting implements that made them formidable predators rather than just scavengers. Imagine being able to make simple tools, but watching your competitors create fire. Fire, the ultimate game changer that provides light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, protection from predators, and the ability to cook food for better nutrition and safety. Homo habilis could see other human groups sitting around fires at night, safe from nocturnal predators, cooking their food, extending their active hours beyond sunset. They could observe the clear advantages that fire provided, but they couldn't replicate the technology themselves. This technological gap meant that every advance made by other human species increased the relative disadvantage of Homo habilis. While they were slowly improving their stone tools, other groups were making quantum leaps in survival technology. The gap wasn't just growing, it was accelerating, and this created a competitive environment where Homo habilis was always playing catch-up with species that were already better adapted for the challenges they were all facing. It wasn't enough to improve. They needed to improve faster than their competitors, and that was simply beyond their capabilities. Their partial success with technology also created false hope that made their failures more devastating. They were just capable enough to believe that solutions were possible, but not capable enough to implement those solutions effectively. It's like being given a puzzle that you're smart enough to recognize has a solution, but not smart enough to actually solve, except the stakes aren't entertainment, they're the survival of your entire species. And speaking of species survival, we haven't yet addressed the most disturbing aspect of Homo habilis' existence, the demographics of death that made their brief lives even more miserable than the raw numbers suggest. Chapter 10. The Demographics of Doom. Why age 10 was your death sentence. Here's a statistic that should chill you to the bone. If you were a Homo habilis who somehow managed to survive to age 10, you had just entered the most dangerous period of your entire life. The researchers who studied those 26 Homo habilis specimens discovered something that defies everything we understand about typical animal mortality patterns. Usually the very young and the very old are most vulnerable to predation and environmental pressures, while healthy adults in their prime have the best survival rates. But for Homo habilis it was almost the opposite. Once you hit age 10, your chances of dying increased dramatically. This age marked what researchers called the phase associated with maximum mortality. But here's the really twisted part. Reaching age 10 already made you one of the lucky ones. Based on demographic analysis, approximately 40% of all Homo habilis individuals died before their 10th birthday, and when you factor in infant and early childhood mortality, that number jumps to around 60%. Think about that for a moment. In a group of 100 Homo habilis children, only 40 would live to see their 10th birthday, and those 40 survivors would then enter the most dangerous period of their lives. Why was age 10 so particularly deadly? The answer lies in the cruel biology of their survival strategy. At age 10, a Homo habilis individual was approaching their maximum size and strength, but they weren't yet experienced enough to navigate the complex dangers of their environment effectively. They were big enough to be seen as a threat by other scavengers, but not big enough to actually defend themselves. They were old enough to participate in dangerous foraging expeditions, but not wise enough to assess risks accurately. Most importantly, age 10 was when they would start venturing further from the safety of their group and familiar territory. Young adult Homo habilis had to establish themselves, find mates, and potentially form new groups. This meant exploring new areas, taking greater risks, and operating without the protection of experienced adults. Imagine being a 10-year-old Homo habilis. You've somehow survived a decade in hell, which makes you practically a sage among your people. But instead of being rewarded with greater safety and security, you're now expected to venture into unknown territories where new predators lurk, where the best scavenging sites are controlled by more experienced groups, where every day brings fresh opportunities for violent death. You're caught in a biological trap, too old to be protected by adults, too young to protect yourself effectively, too small to intimidate competitors, too inexperienced to avoid the countless dangers that await. The demographic data also reveals another horrifying aspect of Homo habilis existence: reproductive pressure. In a species where most individuals die before reaching sexual maturity, there's enormous evolutionary pressure to reproduce as early and as often as possible. This meant that the few Homo habilis who survived to adolescence were immediately thrust into the additional challenges of reproduction and child-rearing in an environment where protecting offspring was nearly impossible. Female Homo habilis would have faced the compound challenges of pregnancy in a high-stress environment, giving birth without medical assistance, and then trying to protect vulnerable infants in a world filled with predators specifically adapted for killing small primates. The fossil record suggests that many female Homo habilis died in childbirth or shortly after giving birth. The combination of poor nutrition, small body size, large infant head size relative to the birth canal, and lack of medical knowledge created a perfect storm of maternal mortality. And for the few infants who survived birth, the challenges were just beginning. Human infants are notably helpless compared to other primates. They can't cling to their mothers effectively, they can't move independently for months, and they require constant care and protection. In a stable environment with abundant resources, this extended childhood allows for brain development and learning. But for Homo habilis, it was just another vulnerability. Infants who couldn't escape danger on their own were liabilities during predator encounters or environmental emergencies. The demographic patterns also suggest something even more disturbing: evidence of what researchers call selective mortality. It wasn't just that young Homo habilis individuals died frequently, they seemed to be specifically targeted by predators. Many of the fossil specimens with clear predator damage are juveniles and young adults. This makes sense from the predator's perspective. Smaller prey is easier to catch and kill, requires less energy to subdue, and presents fewer risks during the attack. But from the Homo habilis perspective, it meant that the individuals who had managed to survive the vulnerable early years were still prime targets for predation. There was no safe age where survival became more likely. And here's perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect: the survivors would have been acutely aware of these patterns. Homo habilis was intelligent enough to recognize that reaching age 10 didn't mean safety, it meant entering a new phase of danger. They would have seen older siblings, friends, and community members disappear with disturbing regularity. This knowledge would have created a psychology of fatalism that pervaded their entire culture. Why plan for the future when the future probably doesn't exist? Why invest in long-term relationships when those relationships are statistically doomed? Why develop complex technologies or social structures when your society is constantly being decimated? In many ways, Homo habilis represents consciousness at its most tragic, aware enough to suffer, but not empowered enough to transcend that suffering. They were the universe's cruel experiment in creating creatures smart enough to understand their own doom but not smart enough to prevent it. But we're not done exploring their misery yet. Because there was one more aspect of Homo habilis' existence that made their brief lives even more horrifying: the constant presence of creatures that seemed designed by evolution specifically to kill them.